Welcome back to This Old Nerd. I am This Old Nerd Iyaz, and this show is all about having the most tech-forward home and life as possible. But since life is short, we want to make sure that the projects we're giving you are doable within like an afternoon. It shouldn't take you forever because you got more important stuff to do, right? Anyway, today's project is so complicated, I have notes. Lots and lots of notes because this is a continuation of episode 1 of this season where we tried to expand our network using Asus's AI Mesh. If you're like, hey, what's Asus AI Mesh? It's a system that if you have an Asus router, you can create a mesh network using other devices. It could be an old router. It can be something like the Blue Cave we talked about in episode 1. It just gives you an easy way to take your old router and your network and expand it using other devices. In my case, I went with AI Mesh because I didn't want to do a full upgrade of my Wi-Fi system just yet. I'll have a Wi-Fi 6 mesh network eventually, but right now I just wanted to do small upgrades because there's a lot of other stuff I need to do. To make this router a node on the network, I had to upgrade the firmware. Every attempt I tried was a nightmare and a failure and a problem, and that's why I wanted to solve that problem. Because life is messy, there was way more than one attempt to get this to work. So I'm gonna run you through a couple of the attempts before we get to the final solution. Attempt number 1, I tried the regular method. I took the router and I attached it to my modem using Ethernet. Then I attached the router to a Mac Mini using Ethernet, thereby making the very strong connection of everything because wireless is not gonna play an issue into this. I go into the web interface of the router, I hit the firmware upgrade, it says upgrade, 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 complete. Firmware upgrade does not change. Bummer. Attempt number 2, I download the firmware directly from Asus's site. I then upload it to the router, and then I wait. Guess what? Same result. Attempt number 3, I go to Asus's troubleshooting site. I would need a Windows machine to complete the firmware restoration. Now, I've done this in the past. And then I had flashbacks, and I'm like, hey, that didn't work. And I spent hours and hours and hours doing that the first time, and it didn't work. It didn't matter. So I took a breath, I sat down, and I'm like, hey, I'm gonna take a break. There's no way I'm gonna do this right now. So I sat for a little bit. This brings me to attempt number 4, and 4 stands for F it. That doesn't make any sense, but it's true. I was like, screw this, I am gonna make this work come hell or high water. At the time I'm doing all this testing, my original home network is down because I have the new router attached to the modem, and I don't like that. So I decide I'm gonna have my main router back up. I'm gonna make sure I have all my stuff going around so I can watch TV while I'm trying to troubleshoot this mess. But the thing is, if I wanna attach 2 routers to one machine, the IP address is important. How am I gonna access each web interface? Because the default IP address on each device is the same, 192.168.1.1. If you've done networking, you probably know that number quite well. So I went to my main router's web interface, I went into advanced settings, then to the LAN page, and there I changed the IP address to something different. In my case, 192.168.3.1, thereby making it possible for me to access both routers when they're attached using 2 different web interfaces because they've got different IP addresses. To attach the second router to my Mac Mini, which only has 1 Ethernet port, I used a USB to Ethernet adapter, and then boom, I had 2 routers attached to 1 computer. Okay, so we've got 2 routers attached to 1 computer, now what? Google search, Google search, Google search, which brings me to this site by Dong No, a networking genius, a former coworker, and a really funny guy. He has a write-up about Asus WRT Merlin and alternative firmware for a number of Asus routers, including the Asus RT-AC68U, the ones I have. And I thought, hey, wait a minute. Maybe if the official firmware isn't working, this other third-party firmware may be useful. You can read all about this alternative firmware. The link's in the description. Don goes into a lot of detail explaining what it can do, how much more power it's got, and also more updates than the official stuff. That's up to you. That's not what this video is about. But I go ahead and I download the Asus WRT Merlin firmware in hopes that maybe this third-party firmware will give this thing some life. So I'm uploading this third-party firmware thinking, hey, it's not gonna work, what's the big deal? I do another Google search and this changes everything. I wrote, can't upgrade firmware at start, 3.0.0.4.374_G9540D57. And this finally led me to the real solution. And attempt number 5. Thank you to Colin Taylor, part of the furniture at SNB Forums, for this. He wrote, if your router is an RT-AC68U, then you need to flash an intermediate firmware version before the final one with a link to the firmware. Oh, this changes everything. Everything. Did I mention that you need to have upgraded firmware at the beginning? At this point, I'm just going to read you my notes because I'm taking notes as I'm doing this because I want to document my steps so I don't make the same mistakes over and over again. At 2:26 p.m., I attempt this intermediate upgrade and I finally see a different note. I took a screenshot because I was so excited. It said, firmware upgrade is done. Please reboot RT-AC68U manually. Holy crap. Are we finally getting somewhere? I'm trying not to be excited at the time when I'm writing it. I reboot the second router by pulling the plug and then putting it back in. Now, at 2:34, the device has rebooted and it shows me this, upgraded firmware. It says powered by Asus WRT Merlin and the firmware is at 378.55. Oh, we're getting somewhere. So this was great, but the thing is, this update does not include the AI mesh feature that we need to turn this into a node. So it's time to get more firmware. At 2:34, I do a new update to see if I can get AI mesh on this thing. I'm trying to get 368.7_2 on there. At 2:36, the firmware is upgrading. It felt so slow. It says it'll take about 3 minutes to update the firmware. 2:39, 3 minutes later, the update says it's complete. Now what? It says firmware upgrade is done. Please reboot RT-AC68U manually. Trying not to get too excited, but something's happening. So I power off the second router, I power it back on. At 2:42, so 2 minutes later, we get this. AI mesh is an option on this thing. But we're not done yet. Why aren't we done yet? Because this router is still set to be a router and we want it to be a node. So we go into the operation mode of this device and we switch it to AI mesh node. This causes the router to restart. Once that was done, I connected an Ethernet cable from the main router to the WAN port of the second router. Then I log back into my main router. I hit the AI mesh node button on the bottom. And on the right side, I clicked the search button. And there it was, the other router as a node. Then there was a pop-up asking me, do you want to add this node on your AI mesh network? And I was like, yeah, I do. So I hit accept. And after what felt like an eternity, I was met with this pop-up saying that the node was successfully added. So now my home network had its router and 2 nodes for a mesh network. It's amazing. So let's talk about the partner acceptance rating. On this show, we want to make sure any tech we bring into our home doesn't really negatively impact the lives of the people we live with. It could be your parents, it could be your wife, it could be your husband, it could be your cat, your dog, your kid even. I need to come up with a rating system, by the way. Let's go out of 5, okay? Now, I just finished this project the other day. I'd say that the partner acceptance rating on this is about a 4.5 out of 5. And why? Why is that? So for my wife and son, things haven't really changed because I already expanded the network with the Blue Cave like I showed you in episode 1. This new node has not been tested for a long time, so unless it causes issues, I don't see the partner acceptance rating dropping to like below a 4.5. This stuff makes the network better, which makes everything work better, which is fantastic for this family. Thank you so much for watching this episode. If you want to help out the show, you can hit a like, hit subscribe, or even go to patreon.com/Iyaz, that's IYAZ. There, you can get early access to the show, thanks from us, and even video credits. Thank you so much for making this show happen, because anything you guys do helps this show become a reality, and maybe even my full-time job. That would be pretty cool. Anyway, I'm Iyaz Akhtar asking you, how's your tech life? Because it could be better. The amount of Google searches I did to find a solution to this was so damn much. It felt like an interminable slog, and the amount of proper troubleshooting versus going to a third-party firmware versus finding this post on SNB forums, it was just so difficult. So if I could help you find stuff